Yes, I'm trying to. Is it on now?
Yeah. Now it's on.
Each of these systems requires that you push a different button, and if I haven't used this system recently, I don't know which button to push. The older I get, the more mistakes I make like that. So I do apologize.
Actually, I had the same problem today, so it's not about age.
Well, it only gets worse. That's the problem. In any case, a year ago, I had the opportunity to speak to an earlier conference of the ICIC, and I am honored and extremely pleased to have the chance to come back and speak with you again. Although I know far less about Circassians and the Circassian cause than almost all of you do, I can present the perspective of a sympathetic and supportive outsider. And that's what I planned to do this morning. As I said a year ago, I was, and I remain quite sure that Circassia is going to be restored, that this will happen within a decade or less, that its independence will be recognized, and that we will all be celebrating an enormous Circassian victory after so many defeats. But at that time, I warned that the very last steps of achieving those goals may very well prove to be the hardest. The ensuing months have made me even more confident, both in my prediction that Circassia will again be independent, and that the path forward is going to be extremely difficult because of Moscow's response to the situation, which curiously has made the outcome possible, but has also made the path to it more difficult. I believe that the Circassian community will be able to overcome these problems only if they face them head on and thus make good use of the resources they have at their disposal. Today, I would like to revisit some of what I said a year ago and update it because of changes in the international environment. What Circassians need to do to achieve their ends has changed, and in some fundamental ways, and that too needs to be recognized. As I said a year ago, Circassians and their supporters must keep in mind 5 important things as they pursue their goals, and as they are forced to respond to what is certain to be increased use by the Kremlin, not only of its police powers, its diplomatic efforts, and its security services, but its propagandistic effort to dismiss the Circassian cause altogether. Those things that Circassians must keep in mind both point to the resources that Circassians have if they will only use them, and to the difficulties in using those resources. First of all, as you all know, Circassians are uniquely positioned to oppose Moscow among all the non-Russians within the current borders of the Russian Federation, because they have both a large number of increasingly radicalized co-ethnics in their homeland and an even larger number of nationally conscious people in the diaspora. Indeed, the Circassians today have the largest diaspora of any people now within the borders of the Russian Federation or Russian Empire. Moreover, the Circassians, including many who are in this group, have learned to make use of the new social media in ways that mean the actions of one part of the Circassian nation strengthen the position of the other, and that Moscow's moves against one lead to new Russian losses at exactly the same time in the other as well. Second, and this was terribly important a year ago, never before has a Circassian nation had such an important ally as it has in Ukraine. There has never been a more powerful state that is prepared to support what the Circassians are about. Kiev recognizes that the Circassians are a natural ally of the Ukrainians in their struggle against Russian imperialism, and they are increasingly willing to support The more deeply Russia becomes embroiled in its war of aggression, the more true that will be, and the more the Ukraine can be counted on to support Circassians. I'm afraid that some of the reporting that people see about the difficulties Ukraine is facing fail to understand that dynamic. If anyone had said in 2020 the Ukrainian parliament would come out in favor of Circassia, no one would have believed it. Now, it's only a matter of time until you have increasingly strong declarations in that regard. Third, and this is related to what's going on in Ukraine, the international community increasingly recognized something that they did not want to recognize and do not, in many cases, want to recognize yet. And that is this: Putin may be the embodiment of the problem, but in fact, as long as the Russian Federation exists as an imperial state, it will remain a threat to world peace and therefore must be dismantled. Among the parts that must be dismantled are its union republics, its regions, and in the form of oblasts and krais, and especially, and this is something that now is increasingly gaining attention, by peoples who have not been recognized as single peoples by Moscow, but who very much are. And the collapse of Russia's system of state administration means that those peoples, they include the Circassians in the first instance, but also the Ukrainians of the so-called Kliny, the wedges across the Russian Federation, have a better chance of escaping Russian imperialism than at any point in the past. Fourth, the Circassians also, like these other groups, have allies within the Russian Federation who are, in fact, ethnic Russians, but not Muscovite in their loyalty. Those people, too, suffer under the Muscovite yoke, and many of them, and this is something that I don't think Circassians are as aware of as they should be. Many of those people now view the Circassians as a nation playing a leadership role in the future transformation of the post-Russian reality, as being much like that played by the three Baltic nations, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians at the end of Soviet times. Had Stalin not made the mistake of annexing the Baltic countries and Western Ukraine, my guess is that the USSR would still be with us. But having gone too far in that direction, it's now come back to haunt him. It's backfired, and Circassians will be the beneficiaries. And fifth, to reiterate something I said before, but which is, I think, absolutely important to understand. When there was, in Soviet times, and initially in post-Soviet Russia, some attention to maintaining the integrity of state institutions, the possibility for an outlier like the Circassians to achieve their goals was much less than it is now, when Putin has done everything in his power to destroy those institutions. Because now the Circassians are in a position not much worse off than the Tatars of Kazan, and much better than many of the other non-Russian peoples. And that's something that I think Circassians need to recognize. Putin is increasingly making mistakes, but his biggest one is that by destroying institutions, he has meant that what will emerge after the end of the Russian Federation will not be a diminished Russia surrounded by a number of former autonomous republics, but an entirely new architecture in which peoples who have long been submerged will recover. The most important of that group, seems to me, are the Circassians, if they will understand what's going on and work to do it. Now, unfortunately, some may conclude from this enumeration of the challenges that Circassia faces, that the prospects for Circassians are so bad, at least immediately, and decide that the best course is to retreat into an inactive pessimism. At the same time, others are likely to conclude that the Circassians are going to win whatever they do, and thus fail to act now. Both those positions are self-defeating. The first, it means because the Circassians would in that event forego all the advantages of the situation today that the situation today presents them with. And second, because it would give Moscow at least temporary victories it certainly doesn't deserve, and that none of the people should have to suffer. Instead, Circassians must, as a group, as a community, recognize that they need to act, and act carefully and thoughtfully. And that means that they must recognize that while they are close to victory, this could be snatched from them if they don't adopt the right strategies and tactics. And that means, first and foremost, that they must recognize that the international environment has changed. It is now vastly more important for Circassians to work in European institutions than unfortunately is with American ones. The future of this part of the world is much more going to be determined in places like Ankara, Brussels, Paris, and Berlin than it is in Washington, D.C., at least for the next several years. That is, as an American, I'm deeply ashamed and horrified that this should be the case. But I'm telling you that unless Circassians understand that and assume that what they have done in the past, often in the United States, is where they should be focusing their effort, they're going to lose out. Europe and Turkey are the places to focus after Ukraine and the fraternal peoples inside the current borders of the Russian Federation. In doing that, in moving toward developing new support, the Circassians must keep in mind one of the oldest rules of politics. It's much easier to lose your supporters than it is to gain new ones. That means that one has to think about what one says and does with an eye to how will this help us maintain our alliances or develop them. And that means is even more difficult now that the focus of this is going to be in Europe and Turkey and Kiev rather than in Washington. At the same time, the Circassians must be ready, willing, and they certainly are able to reach out not only to non-Russian nations, but to Russian regionalists in the North Caucasus and more generally across the Russian Federation. Not only will that give Circassians a seat at the table for what is going to be a comprehensive reordering of the territory Moscow now nominally controls, but it will ensure that after that redivision takes place, the Circassian nation will be in a much better position to survive and flourish than it would be if it remains an outsider. That's going to be difficult. It goes against all the kinds of feelings people have as members of an ethnic community long oppressed. But unless it is done, then there's a great danger that Circassians will come out of all this much less well off than would otherwise be the case. In addition, the Circassians have to recognize that their unique resource, the diaspora, can be a force multiplier and must be. One of the things that I very much hope is that the Circassians will develop a single internet site that reports the news on a daily basis about Circassia in a multitude of languages so that people will keep up with it. It's often very difficult to track down the news about Circassia. We have, thanks to scholars like Adel Bashkawi, we know a great deal about the past. We know a whole lot less about what happened last week, and yet what happened last week may prove as fateful as anything that happened a century or more ago. I would urge you, if you do nothing else at this conference, to commit yourselves to creating a portal, multi-language, so you can toggle among it, Turkish, Circassian, Arabic, English, French, German, and Ukrainian, so that people can keep up. I'm more than happy to help and work, having been present at the creation of the old RFERL Daily Report, Newsline, and more recently Window on Eurasia. I know how to do those sorts of things. But if you do that, you will then find that you build on the support you now have, because people will have easy access to the information that so many of you possess, but are not currently in a position to share. And the last 2 points I want to make are these. Circassians need to recognize that they will only be strong if they are united, but they will only be united if they recognize that being united doesn't mean a totalitarian agreement on everything. It is terribly important that Circassians agree on certain basic principles, but it is not critical that they agree on everything. That's one of the hardest things to do politically, but it is one of the most necessary, because unless it is done, I promise you, the Russian security services know very, very well how to promote division and how to exploit it. And therefore, that's a critical dimension. And finally, the Circassians must be alive to this. The closer they come to achieving their goal of a revived Circassia, the more violent and subversive Moscow will become. Because this time around, the demise of the Russian Empire is going to be far more radical and may even lead to the end of Russia as a state entirely. Faced with that fear, Russians in Moscow are going to behave much worse than they've behaved in the past. There are ways to fight that. One of the best ways is with information. And that comes back to what I wanted to make the centerpiece of my remarks this year: the need to create a portal to keep people updated on what's going on in Circassia and among Circassians, so that you will be able to count on all of the people in countries of goodwill to support your effort. The evidence is clear once people see it. But if they don't see the evidence and the only thing they hear about Circassia appears in Russian first, I promise you they will get the wrong message. Again, I want to thank the organizers of this meeting for allowing me, very much an outsider, to take part, a friendly outsider, supporter, but an outsider nonetheless. I also hope that the day is not far distant when the ICIC will be able to hold such sessions, not in foreign capitals, but in a revived and flourishing Circassian state. And I hope, God willing, that I will have the chance to meet with you all again then and there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for really important points. And thank you for your support, and thank you for your friendship. Actually, I'm one of the biggest fans, by the way. I always read everything that you write.
I'm flattered.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.